All right, going to continue our study of the apostles. And tonight we're going to talk about Matthew and Thomas. Tom, do you know what your namesake, what it means?
Prince.
Prince. Well, that's better than what I came up with.
I made it up.
That sounds like a good one to me.
The ancient Hebrew for Thomas is the twin. And his nickname in Greek was Didymus, which also means the twin. We don't know what the guy's name was. He has a title that he was somebody's twin, and we don't know who the twin was.
David knows, he's an expert.
David knows stuff. No. But anyway, Thomas, he is most known by his other name, Doubting Thomas, which is really a misnomer. I mean, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and said the wrong thing, but he really has some great qualities that, and we don't know a lot about him, but what we do know kind of evens itself out. He was a little bit like Peter in that he was prone to be very kind of in or out, that he would get excited and want to, let's die with Jesus if we have to, and then he'd turn around and get that nickname of being Doubting Thomas. Look over at John 11, give you an example. John chapter 11, verse 8. This is when Lazarus is sick. And so they're having that conversation where Jesus is speaking spiritually and the apostles are hearing physically. And he says that Lazarus has fallen asleep. And the apostles say, well, good. If he sleeps, maybe he'll feel better. And finally Jesus says, well, no, he's actually died. In verse 8, he says, I'm going to go back to Judea. So he's going to go to where Lazarus and his sisters are. Verse 8, but Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back? Jesus says, well, there's still 12 hours of daylight. Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see this world's light. It's when a person walks at night that they stumble, because they have no light. After he said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. And Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought that he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let's go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us go that we may die with him. So for people that speak Hebrew and Greek, the idea that he said, so the twin, who was also known as the twin, it's kind of an odd translation for them, but for us English speakers, it's nice that he filled us in. Thomas, also known as Didymus, said, well, let's just go with him. If we have to die with him, then we die with him. So he has a little bit of that Peter-esque kind of quality in him, that whatever's going to happen, I've got your back, Jesus. Let's go do whatever we need to do.
Say the New King James says, who is called the twin.
Who is called the twin.
Yeah.
Didymus, who's known...
Then Thomas, who is called the twin.
Absolutely. So they translate the Greek and leave the Hebrew on that one. Look at chapter 20, still in John. John chapter 20, verse 24.
Oh, there it is again.
There it is again. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus,
Twin.
New King James has also known as the twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came, so the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, put my hand into his side, I will not believe. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And And Thomas said to him, My Lord and my God. And Jesus said, Because you have seen me, you believe. Blessed are those who have not seen and who yet believe. So kind of interesting set of parameters for Thomas as far as his faith was concerned. Unless I can stick my finger where the nails were, unless I can put my hand into his side, I'm not going to believe. That's the bottom line for my believing in the resurrection. I've got to see him physically. I've got to touch him physically to make sure it's not an apparition or a ghost or something. And Jesus just challenges him straight to his face. I know what you said, and go ahead. If you want to touch me, go ahead and touch me. Just by show of hands, how many people think Thomas actually took him up on that and reached out and touched him? Got a couple in class. I'm not sure that I would. I think that I would be so embarrassed, so ashamed that I had said that I wouldn't do it. But they were friends. They'd been together for 3 years. Maybe Thomas took him up on it and said, well, okay, as long as you're offering, let me stick my hand in the nail holes and put my hand into the side. And then Jesus says, well, you can see me and you believe. Blessed are the ones who have never seen me and yet believe. So it's a wonderful blessing that gets passed down from generation to generation to generation when a new bunch believes in somebody that they've never seen, and they believe in nail scars and in a wound in his side that they never saw. As far as Thomas's career, we think he went to India and was martyred in India. Again, all of these stories are, take them with a grain of salt. We don't know for sure, but most of the scholars seem to buy into this idea that he was killed by a Hindu priest near Madras. There is a large Christian community in that district, in that area of India, near Madras. I used to do a little bit of World Bible School where you mail lessons to them and they do the lesson and mail it back and go through a series of correspondence courses that way. And there were a lot of students around Madras, India. The Hindu religion probably predates Abraham. It's, if not the oldest, it's got to be close to being the oldest religion on the planet. It's been there a long, long time. And people who are Hindus by birth and by faith and by custom and by tradition and by their surroundings, they don't give it up easily. And we have a lot of folks who have been martyred through the years because Hindus didn't like Christianity being preached there. I had one guy that was a student of mine at Northwestern who moved to India, and he would just as soon not have you talk about that on Facebook when we Facebook together. Don't say everything you know about why I'm in India, because I live in the middle of a bunch of people that probably would not take it very kindly if they knew that that was the reason that I moved to India in the first place. So, Tom?
The ministry that I work with, the books that I passed out, we've had about 8 or 10, maybe 6 or 8 martyrs.
Yeah.
Our storytellers go out and do speaking to town.
Yeah, it is not, well, it may be a nationalistic religion. I don't think it's an official national religion, but it may be. But you get into a neighborhood, we talk about the fierceness of Islam in fighting against someone coming in and trying to spread the gospel. There are Hindus that are equally as prone to kill if they feel like they need to. Evidently, he was run through with a spear. And again, we're not 100% sure that that's what happened to him, but that seems to be the prevailing opinion. Which brings us to Matthew. Matthew also has more than one name. He's known as Matthew in Matthew's Gospel. He's known as Levi in Mark and Luke. But in all of them, when you get to the lists, he's Matthew. So the call of Matthew, and we'll read it here in a couple of different places, he refers to himself as Matthew all the time. And that's the way we refer to him. As the writer of what we call the first gospel, people know the name of Matthew, even if they don't know much else about the New Testament. Who wrote the Gospels? Well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. People start reading through the New Testament on January 1st. I've made a New Year's resolution. I'm going to read through the New Testament. Most people get through Matthew. Right? So next year, if you're going to start reading the New Testament again, where do you start? In Matthew, and maybe you get through Matthew. So a lot of people know Matthew more than they know the other Gospels. And toward the end of this, we'll talk a little bit about the Gospel of Matthew. But look at Matthew 9. Matthew chapter 9. Beginning in verse 9. As Jesus was going on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many of the collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And we'll just leave it right there. Look at Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2. Beginning in verse 13. See if this sounds familiar. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Okay. Now look at Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5. In verse 27. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who belonged to their sect, complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Right? So Matthew and Levi, obviously the same guy. Now, Luke gets finished introducing Levi as this guy. Now look over at verse 12. Luke chapter 6, verse 12. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray. He spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So Luke introduces him as Levi the tax collector, but when he gives the list of the apostles, he calls him Matthew. Mark does the same thing. So it's interesting. His names are less important, I guess, than who he was and what he did, but we know him as Matthew because we have the Gospel of Matthew. We don't have a Gospel according to Levi in there anywhere. When Mark introduces him, he introduces him as Levi, the son of Alphaeus. There's another guy in the group known as James, the son of Alphaeus. So to me it seemed obvious, well, maybe these guys are brothers. but the scholarship did not immediately jump up and go, oh, here's another set of brothers. I think there were 6 guys at least in the group that were brothers. Or how would you say that? There were 3 sets of brothers. So there were at least 6 guys who had a brother in the group. And perhaps Matthew and James were brothers as well. So under the name Levi, son of Alphaeus, they're never called brothers. So I thought, well, okay, Peter and Andrew are called brothers, James and John are called brothers. So since it doesn't say Matthew and his brother James, we never see that, then maybe they weren't brothers. And then I started reading the lists. The lists don't always call the brothers brothers. We know they are, but they don't always put them together that way in the lists. So it's kind of hard to know by that indicator whether they were brothers or not either. So we'll just have to leave it with not completely sure. Look at Luke's list. Simon, whom he called Peter, his brother Andrew, and then he goes on with James, John, Philip, Bartholomew. He doesn't say James and his brother John, but we know that James and John were brothers. John doesn't ever, the Gospel of John, we don't ever get a list from him, but look at Acts chapter 1. We get another list also from Luke. Right, so same writer. And in let's start in 12. Acts chapter 1, verse 12. The apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath day's walk from the city. When they arrived, they went upstairs to the room where they were staying. Those present were Peter, John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. So he doesn't even put Peter, Andrew, James, and John as brothers in that list. So it's really hard to decide how many of them were brothers besides Peter and Andrew, James, and John. I think it would have been a logical thing to have called them that way. It makes sense to me that Peter and Andrew and James and John, they all knew each other. They had worked together. They had brothers in the group. That would help the group congeal. That would stick close if you had that kind of group. So if we have another pair of brothers, that's good. Thomas, as a twin, was his twin in the group. Maybe the reason that Matthew got called, other than the fact that Jesus could use him in a better way than him being a tax collector. As a tax collector, he could read, he could write, and he could do math at least. So he'd be a useful guy to have around. He was an intelligent guy, just by his job description. They didn't hire just anybody to be in charge of that. He was probably a very loyal guy, might not have been loyal to the right people at some times in his life. Don't know whether he worked for the Romans or whether he worked for the Herods. That little area around Capernaum and Bethsaida up there in the north of the lake was right next to the line that divided 2 of the Herod sons that inherited parts of the kingdom. So when you came out of one of their jurisdictions into the other, you paid a tax. So Matthew is probably stationed right there near the border. And if you're going from south to north, there's a tax to be paid for this brother. And if you're going from north to south, there's a tax to be paid for this brother. Kind of like a tollway. We were in Dallas to help get Daddy's stuff ready a couple of weeks ago. And now they just have cameras. So when you drive underneath the camera on the tollway, it takes a picture of your car, of your license plate. They just send you a bill in the mail. So here in a few days, I'll get a bill for probably $15 or $20 for driving on the tollways in Dallas. It's a whole lot easier than the old way when we had to slow down and throw the change into the toll booth collection area. But that was Matthew's job. He was a toll operator, and they went back and forth and paid him on the way through. Yes, ma'am.
Well, Matthew was also interested in genealogy because he counted the 40 generations.
Absolutely.
I mean, he researched the generations between Abraham and Christ.
Right. We're going to talk about his style of writing here in a minute, because he really was dedicated to the idea that Jesus was that prophesied Messiah / King of Israel. And so he starts his genealogy is set out to prove that Jesus is a good candidate for that. Let's get rid of his death real quick, because it's a weird one. We think that he died in Ethiopia, which is not too far-fetched. There was a Christian community, there was a Jewish community, eventually a Christian community in Ethiopia. But the story about how he died got embellished at some point. So you start out with, he was preaching against local religion, he was preaching against the king, and maybe against the king's morality. So the king had him killed, run through with spears, or maybe impaled. That's easy enough to believe. Later on, the story becomes that the king had a crush on a nun, and the king was wanting to be with the nun, and Matthew told him, you know, she's married to Jesus, and so you can't be with the nun. Well, nuns didn't happen for about another 500 years. So probably didn't get killed for telling the king to leave the nuns alone. But that's one of the stories that is told anyway about it. But probably he went to Ethiopia and preached the gospel and was calling people to repent, and one of them might have been the king, and then the king had him killed. So that's at least a good possibility. All right, to what Kathy brought up. Look at Matthew chapter 1. The way he gets into his gospel is different than the other three. Luke includes a genealogy, but Matthew starts with a genealogy because he wants to prove that Jesus is the Messiah and that he is a rightful candidate to the throne of Israel. And we won't read the whole thing, but it says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So he has three guys that he wants you to think about, right? Abraham. Why Abraham? You can't be a Hebrew unless you're descended from Abraham, right? He's the father of the faithful. He's the beginning of the lineage of all the Hebrews. The son of David. Why do we need to be son of David? You can't be a great king of Israel unless you're in the lineage of David. So if he's going to be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he needs to have some connection to King David. And then in the middle of that, he throws in the carrying away into Babylon. So you've got 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the carrying away to Babylon, and 14 from the carrying away to Babylon until Messiah comes. So he sets that up specifically to prove that Jesus is the called Messiah, right? And he includes that Babylonian captivity as kind of a way of saying the people were sent away to be punished, but God brought them back, and now God is going to reestablish his kingdom. So you get that 14 generations from Babylon to Jesus, from Babylon to Messiah. He never makes any bones about the fact that he wants you to believe that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the anointed one. So when you get over to chapter 16, and Jesus says, well, who do people think I am? And Peter says, well, we know who you are. You're the Christ. You're the anointed one. Right? You're the Son of the living God. So Matthew's entire gospel is set up particularly for Jews to understand who Jesus is. There is a theory, in fact, the theory goes all the way back to the 2nd century. One of the early Christian writers said that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew, and that then people later on translated it into Greek. So Matthew wrote for a Jewish audience. When you get to Mark, Mark wrote for a Gentile audience, for a Roman audience. And the things that he emphasizes are very Roman. He interprets stuff for us, right? Jesus says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Matthew gives us the words. Mark translates it for us, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So Mark has an audience that needs to understand why Jesus would say that and what it means. Matthew doesn't. Matthew's audience, they would have known. Right? The odd thing is that Mark probably wrote first, and then Matthew had access to Mark's writings, but Mark didn't write for Jews. I think maybe when Matthew sees Mark's gospel, he writes a very, very similar gospel. We're talking about, if you take Mark and lay it down, 95% of what Mark has in his gospel is in Matthew. 95%. When Luke writes his gospel, about 75%, word for word out of Mark. So then they take what they've got and they improve it. Maybe improve it's not the right word. They adapt it for an audience that they're trying to reach. So Matthew's very interested in reaching Jews. Luke is more interested in the broader spectrum of people. So he sees Mark's writings, he uses some of what Mark has, and he adds more to it that's going to be more useful to this other group. So that's the prevailing idea anyway, that Mark wrote first and that Matthew and Luke knew about Mark when they wrote and used parts of it to reach different groups. But it's Matthew is definitely written to a Jewish audience. When you get to the Sermon on the Mount, there's a long section where Jesus says, you have heard it said that you should not do this. I think the King James has, you have heard it said by those of old. You have heard it said by those of old time. Don't commit adultery. But I say, right? And he reinterprets the law. Matthew approaches it that way because everybody that's Hebrew that's reading Matthew knows the law. So Matthew says, here's what the law says. And then Jesus says, but here's what I say. And so he adds to the law. Mark doesn't include this because his audience, they didn't know the law of Moses. It wasn't something that they grew up with or would have recognized immediately. You have heard it was said to the people long ago, don't break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. The Jews would immediately go, yep, I've heard that all my life. But Jesus said, don't swear at all. So Matthew introduces a group of people who already know God and already know old law to their Messiah, and just keeps reminding them that he is really the Messiah. And for them, the big sign, what sign will you give us that you're really Messiah? What's the sign? I'll give you one sign, the sign of the prophet Jonah. Right? If you are a Gentile, what does that mean? Right? Who's Jonah? What are you talking about? As Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth. And so he uses illustrations and he gives examples of Jesus' ministry that Jews would readily understand. So imagine this guy leaving behind all of his familiarity. The surroundings in Jerusalem would have been all the Jews that he would write to, people that would believe like he believed and were raised like he was raised, and move to a foreign country and try to tell a group of people who don't know any old law, who don't know who the real true God is. They've got thousands of gods. And try to tell them that there's one true God and that his son Jesus is the king. He's the Messiah. What does that mean to them? It was a hard road to hoe to take people who'd never heard of the one true God and try to convince them that he's the one they need to listen to and that his son died for them. How do you get that message across to a group of, ancient religious Hindus? It would be a tough mission. So if that's really what happened to him, if that's really where he went, he had a tough life and eventually was martyred because of it. Now, again, some of those things you could just take with a grain of salt. Out of all of what I've said, if you read Matthew, you'll see what his reasoning was, why he wrote his gospel, who he was writing to. That's easy enough. But the periphery stuff, whether he borrowed from Mark or knew about Mark or ever went to India, all of those things, maybe yes and maybe not.